minus 40 degrees outside. Your breath turns into ice crystals the moment it leaves your lips. Your fingers feel like frozen sausages that could snap off if you hit them against a rock. How on earth did our ancestors survive in conditions that would turn a modern hiker into a frozen statue in under 1 hour? They did not have high-tech thermal layers or modern insulation, yet they managed to thrive in the heart of the Ice Age. The secret was not just huddling together like penguins, though that definitely helped. Archaeological evidence suggests that clothing was the true lifesaver. We are talking about multiple layers of animal furs. They were masters of hide preparation. They used stone scrapers to remove every bit of fat and tissue. Then, they treated the leather to keep it soft and flexible, rather than letting it turn into a dry, brittle sheet of cardboard. They wore inner layers with the fur facing the skin for maximum insulation. This created a tiny microclimate that kept their core temperature stable. But what about sleeping? Imagine lying on the permafrost. To keep from turning into a human icicle, they dug into the earth, literally. Excavations reveal they often slept on raised platforms or beds made of layers of insulating organic material. They used things like dry grass, pine boughs, or animal furs. This elevated their bodies away from the freezing ground. They understood that ground contact is the fastest way to lose body heat. When you sleep in a group, sharing warmth, you are essentially creating a collective heating unit. It was cold, yes, but they were not just surviving. They were adapting with a level of ingenuity that would put our modern camping skills to shame. They lived, they moved, and they absolutely refused to let the glacial cold freeze their potential. Why would a group of starving, shivering nomads keep a frail, gray-haired elder around when every extra mouth to feed was a gamble with death? In the harsh, unforgiving world of the Stone Age, where the average life expectancy was short and the cold was relentless, you might think a slow-moving grandparent was just dead weight. But here is the truth that archaeology screams at us. Those elders were actually the most valuable survival tool your ancestors possessed. Forget the romantic myths of wise sages sitting by the fire. This was about cold, hard, biological utility. Scientists call this the grandmother hypothesis. Evidence suggests that in small bands of hunter-gatherers, the older generation served as a vital safety net. While the younger adults were out chasing giant mammoths or trekking across frozen plains to find food, the elders were back at the base camp, managing the resources. They were the original librarians of the Stone Age. They knew exactly which plants were poisonous, which shrubs held roots when the snow was 3 feet deep, and exactly where the hidden water sources remained unfrozen during the peak of the glacial winter. Without their memories of past climate cycles, the group would have literally walked into extinction. They were the ones who kept the infants safe, allowing the mothers to maximize the food intake of the group. An elder was not a burden. They were a hard drive filled with centuries of survival data. They were the difference between starving in the dark and making it to the next thaw. Without them, your family line would not exist. What did you do if you broke your leg 10,000 years ago? You did not have an emergency room, a surgeon, or even a basic bottle of pain relief medicine. You just had your tribe and a lot of grit. Modern medicine feels like magic, but our ancestors were surprisingly good at keeping the show on the road without it. Evidence suggests that Stone Age people had a working knowledge of anatomy simply through the process of butchering game. They knew exactly where the arteries and major organs were, and they applied that understanding to their own kin. When a bone snapped, they actually used splints made from wood or bark, tied with animal tendon to keep the limb still while it knit back together. We have found skeletal remains from the ancient era showing clean fractures that healed perfectly aligned. This tells us someone was definitely looking after the patient, but the real ingenuity was in their pharmacy, which was essentially the great outdoors. Anthropologists believe they used certain plants like willow bark. It contains natural ingredients that act just like aspirin to dull the pain of a nasty infection or a fever. They did not have modern medicine, but they understood the basics of hygiene and used the natural cleaning properties of local resins to dress deep wounds. It was not always successful, of course, but the fact that so many lived into their 50s proves that primitive surgery and herbal care kept our species alive long enough to pass on their genes. They were the original survivalists, patching each other up with nothing but sap, twigs, and sheer determination. Did they actually perform brain surgery with sharp rocks? If you think our ancestors were just grunting cavemen swinging clubs, think again, because the evidence suggests they were performing complex medical procedures long before the invention of sterile tools or modern medicine. We are talking about drilling a hole directly into a living person's skull. Archaeological findings from thousands of years ago reveal skulls with perfectly circular holes that show clear signs of bone regrowth. This proves that the patient did not just survive the procedure, but actually lived for years afterward. Can you imagine the grit required to undergo that without a drop of medicine to stop the pain? While it sounds like a nightmare scenario, scientists believe these early surgeries were often used to treat severe head trauma, chronic headaches, or potentially even what we would now classify as epilepsy. Imagine the surgeon, likely a highly respected member of the group, meticulously scraping away at the bone with a sharpened flint blade, praying that they would not puncture the delicate membrane beneath. They did not have hospitals, but they had a sophisticated understanding of anatomy and an ironclad commitment to survival. They used natural plant resins to seal wounds and moss as an early form of bandage. These people were tough, they were observant, and they were quite literally holding each other's lives together with nothing but steady hands and razor-sharp stone. How did they manage childbirth without doctors? Imagine being in the heart of the Ice Age, the wind howling outside your cavern, and labor begins. Forget what you have seen in dramatic movies. There were no sterile hospital rooms, no painkillers, and definitely no surgeons on standby. So, how did they pull it off? Anthropological evidence suggests that childbirth was never a solitary event in the ancient era. Scientists believe that early humans practiced something called the midwife effect. Living in tight-knit groups, women did not face the most vulnerable moment of their lives alone. Experienced mothers and grandmothers were right there, providing essential support. When you are living in a survival-first environment, your social circle is your most critical asset. We know from skeletal remains that, while birth was undeniably risky, these women were supported by peers who knew exactly how to position them for gravity to work in their favor. It was not about fancy tools, but about collective wisdom. The mother would typically crouch or squat, using leverage that modern medicine has only recently rediscovered as the most effective posture. While the risk of infection and complications remained a brutal reality of the era, the social structure of hunter-gatherers ensured that, more often than not, the next generation survived to keep the human lineage sprinting across the tundra. It was not just biology. It was community engineering at its finest. Who says you need a sharp spear to be the most dangerous person in the tribe? If you think our ancestors were just a bunch of brawny hunters obsessed with chasing mammoths, think again. The real secret weapon of early humanity was not a bigger muscle. It was grandmother. Anthropologists call it the grandmother hypothesis, and honestly, it is the reason we are not extinct today. Imagine you are a toddler in the harsh ice age. Your mom is busy hauling firewood, processing hides, and maybe dodging a hungry cave lion. She cannot be everywhere at once. That is where the older generation stepped in. While the younger adults were out burning calories on the hunt, the elders were the stable core of the camp. They were the walking libraries of survival. They knew exactly which plants were edible, where the water would be during a drought, and how to track game when the signs were faint. They were not just sitting around. They were managing the logistics of existence. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities with older members had significantly higher survival rates for children. Grandmothers provided consistent food support, gathering high-yield foods like tubers and seeds that did not require the high-risk energy of a big game hunt. They were the ones who kept the home fires burning, physically and metaphorically. They watched the little ones, taught them how to weave cordage or shape stone, and passed down the complex cultural rules that kept the group from falling apart. Without the elder generation, the loss of knowledge in the tribe would have been fatal. So, the next time you think about the primitive struggle, remember the elderly members of the clan. They were the original engineers of human longevity, turning a brutal world into a place where our species could actually thrive instead of just clinging to life by a thread. How did they survive the first pandemics? If you think a sniffle or a fever was a minor inconvenience back in the Stone Age, you are dead wrong. Imagine living in a tight-knit clan where a single cough could signal the beginning of a total community collapse. There were no pharmacies, no modern drugs, and certainly no medical appointments. When illness struck, your immune system was basically the only line of defense, backed up by some surprisingly clever, if a bit grim, natural instincts. Scientists believe that early humans lived in small enough groups that many massive, sweeping pandemics we know today simply could not thrive. The germs would run out of people to infect before they could jump to the next tribe. However, that did not mean life was germ-free. Evidence suggests they dealt with constant parasites, gut infections, and nasty skin ailments. How did they fight back? Archaeology reveals the use of early natural medicines. Take the Neanderthals, for instance. Analysis of their teeth shows traces of poplar tree bark and moldy vegetable matter. This was essentially natural pain relief and primitive medicine. They were not just foraging for snacks, they were self-medicating. When someone caught a fever, the tribe did not just abandon them. We see evidence of healed fractures and long-term care for the disabled, which suggests that social support was actually our most effective tool against infection. They understood the value of keeping the sick away from the main food preparation areas, perhaps instinctively. It was not science as we know it, but for a world without microscopes, their survival strategy was nothing short of brilliant. How did they survive childhood when the world outside was literally trying to freeze them to death? If you think modern parenting is stressful, try raising a toddler in the middle of the last glacial maximum with nothing but a hide wrap and a very sharp spear. Scientists believe that childhood in the Stone Age was not the short and brutal nightmare some early researchers imagined. Instead, evidence suggests it was a masterclass in communal living. Parents were not lone wolves. They relied on what researchers call alloparenting. This means grandma, grandpa, and the rest of the tribe were essentially your built-in daycare. Since survival required constant movement, mothers did not carry their babies everywhere solo. Instead, the kids were socialized by the entire group, learning to observe, mimic, and eventually master the complex art of shaping stone or identifying edible roots before they even lost their baby teeth. You did not get a timeout in a corner. You got a lesson in not getting eaten by a cave lion. Archaeological finds of small, abandoned toys made of bone or wood show us that these kids played just like ours, but their games were high-stakes simulations of adult skills. It was not child labor. It was a necessary, immersive education. They did not have screens, but they had the entire wild world as their classroom. They learned that silence while stalking prey was the difference between a feast and a famine, and honestly, that is a pretty solid life lesson. How did they manage to find water in a frozen world? When the rivers were locked in ice, how did they stay hydrated? It seems counterintuitive, but when the world is frozen, water is actually everywhere. The problem is that it is all locked up as solid ice. Drinking ice directly is a dangerous move because it lowers your body temperature, which is the last thing you want when you are fighting for warmth. Archaeological data and anthropological studies suggest that humans had to get creative. They used heat stones, which are rocks they heated in the fire until they were glowing red, and then dropped them into containers filled with snow or ice to melt it into drinkable water. It sounds slow, but it was an essential part of the daily rhythm. Water was life, and they treated it with immense respect. They also relied on their deep knowledge of the landscape. They knew where the ground warmed up near geothermal vents or where certain animal paths led to seasonal springs that stayed liquid even in the deep freeze. They were constantly reading the land, looking for subtle clues that told them where the water was hiding. They did not have pipes, but they had a deep, ancestral intuition for where the lifeblood of the earth was flowing. What about their shelter? Were they always living in dark, damp caves? Not necessarily. While the image of the caveman in his cavern is famous, the reality was much more varied. Evidence shows that in regions where caves were not available, like the vast open plains of Europe, they built elaborate shelters. We are talking about massive dwellings made from mammoth bones and covered with thick, multi-layered hides. Think of them as the original prefabricated homes. They would take the sturdy ribs and tusks of the mammoth, arrange them in a circle or a dome, and stretch animal skins over the top to keep the wind out. These were sophisticated structures that were designed to stand up to the crushing weight of snow and the biting force of the wind. Inside, they would have hearths for the fire, which provided heat and light, and they would organize the space to keep the sleeping area distinct from the butchery area. It was clean, efficient, and surprisingly comfortable given the conditions. They knew that a well-built shelter was as important as a good spear. Living in a cave was a luxury, but living in a mammoth bone house was a testament to human resourcefulness. They adapted the environment to suit their needs, proving that our ancestors were builders long before they were farmers. How did they light the night without electricity? The nights were long, dark, and often dangerous. Imagine sitting in a pitch-black cave with only the dim flicker of a fire. How did they keep that light going? They were masters of pyrotechnology. They did not just use wood. They used animal fats, oils, and even specific types of moss to create long-lasting torches and lamps. Archaeological findings show small stone bowls that were used as lamps. They would fill them with animal fat and use a wick made from dry plant fibers. This produced a steady, warm light that could burn for hours. This was not just for comfort. It allowed them to work on tools, mend clothing, and share stories long after the sun had gone down. It was the original indoor lighting system. The fire was the heart of the home, the source of warmth, the light that pushed back the darkness, and the place where the social fabric of the tribe was woven. Without fire, the Stone Age would have been a much darker and much shorter story for humanity. They understood the physics of combustion better than we give them credit for. They knew which woods burned hot and long, which ones crackled and popped, and how to maintain the embers even while moving to a new location. They carried the fire with them, literally and figuratively, ensuring that the light of the tribe never went out. We have talked about their medical skills, their social structure, and their housing, but let us talk about their food. How did they manage to get enough calories to survive in such a harsh environment? We often think of them just chasing big animals, but that is only half the story. Archaeology suggests that the diet of the Ice Age human was incredibly diverse. Yes, they hunted mammoth, reindeer, and wild horses, but they were also master-gatherers. They ate a massive variety of seasonal plants, roots, berries, seeds, and nuts. They knew the landscape so well that they could track the arrival of every plant. When one food source was scarce, they moved to the next. They were opportunistic, which is a nice way of saying they ate whatever they could get their hands on. They processed their food with care. They dried meat to preserve it, they ground seeds into flour, and they cooked almost everything to make it easier to digest. They were the original masters of the land. They lived with the seasons, not against them. Their health, their strength, and their survival were all tied to this intimate relationship with the natural world. They were not just surviving, they were thriving in an environment that we would find impossible to navigate today. Finally, we have to talk about their clothing. It was not just about fur. It was a complex system of layers. They had to deal with sweat. If you are active, you sweat. If that sweat freezes, you are in big trouble. Their clothing systems were designed to wick moisture away from the skin and keep them dry. They used specialized needles made from bone to sew furs into precise patterns that allowed for movement while still providing warmth. They had hats, mittens, and footwear that were as advanced as anything we see in early traditional cultures today. These were not just wraps. These were high-performance garments. They knew that a single rip in a seam could be fatal in the deep cold, so they maintained their clothing with the same care they used to maintain their tools. Every stitch was a calculated move in the game of survival. They were not just people in furs, they were individuals who had mastered the art of living in the most extreme environment on the planet. We have covered so much ground, from the deep cold of the Ice Age to the warmth of the communal hearth. We have looked at how they slept, how they healed, how they gave birth, and how they cared for their elders. Every single one of these facts points to the same conclusion. Our ancestors were not the primitive, grunting creatures we often see in cartoons. They were intelligent, capable, and deeply social beings who navigated a brutal world with grace and ingenuity. They were the ones who paved the way for us. They were the ones who survived so that we could be here today. The next time you find yourself complaining about a cold winter or a small inconvenience, take a moment to remember the people who lived, thrived, and passed on the flame of humanity through the deepest, coldest, and longest night in history. They did not have the tools we have, but they had something even better. They had each other, they had a deep understanding of their world, and they had an unbreakable spirit. That is the true story of human survival. That is the story of your ancestors, and it is a story that is still being told, one piece of evidence at a time. The Ice Age was not the end of the line for them. It was the forge in which the modern human was made. And looking back at how they did it, it is clear that we are the descendants of the most resilient, adaptable, and clever survivors the planet has ever seen. The journey of human survival is not just a collection of dates and names. It is a story of adaptation. Every tool they shaped, every fire they kindled, and every life they helped sustain was a victory over the elements. As we look at the evidence left behind in the silent caves and the frozen soil, we see more than just bones and stone. We see the heartbeat of our species. We see the laughter of children playing with bone toys, the quiet patience of the elders passing down wisdom, and the relentless drive of the hunters bringing back the bounty. We see a life that was lived with intent and purpose. The cold may have been harsh, but their spirit was stronger. The world may have been unforgiving, but they found beauty and meaning in the struggle. They were human in every way that counts, and their legacy is written in the very DNA that makes you who you are today. So, keep looking, keep asking, and keep learning. The past is not dead. It is waiting for us to understand it. And in that understanding, we find a bit of ourselves. Thank you for walking through this ancient world with me. Stay curious, stay sharp, and keep seeking the truth about our incredible past.